Let us now look at different aspects of the poems. First, the themes in the garden. The Garden by Andrew Marvell captures the themes of natural beauty, poetic imagination, and spirituality. Here in this poem, Marvell seems to be a priest of nature. He finds himself in an ambience that gives a soothing sensation to his soul. He cherishes each moment in the slow journey through the garden. It is not that the subject matter of the poem only revolves around the garden. The poet captures nature as a whole, and the garden is a part of it. Using his poetic imagination, Marvell simply mesmerizes the readers. His illustration is a sculpture of his poetic imagination and genius. He goes beyond the stock metaphors and imagery. The metaphysical elements come along as he weaves his verse. He presents the natural garden in a way that seems it is one of the heavens of in the earth. As there are many such gardens, there are several other abodes on the earth too. Last but not the least, the theme of spirituality comes knocking at the mind's door. The beauty of the garden helps the poet to attain a state of trance, एक तरीके से मंत्र मुग्ध हो जाना. The poem is nothing but a spiritual contemplation on the grace of the garden. The celebration of retreat from the cares of the world is a common theme in Roman poetry, particularly that of Horace, and there is evidence that Marvell wrote the garden while serving as tutor to Lord Fairfax's daughter at his country estate, Appleton House. A general of the Parliamentarian forces, Fairfax had retired following the recent civil war that brought Oliver Cromwell to power. The question with respect to this theme is whether to take the poem as serious commendation of such a decision or as playful mockery of it. Marvell may well have written this poem the same year he wrote his famous Horatian Ode upon Cromwell's return from Ireland, in which he celebrates the restless Cromwell for leaving his gardens and urging his active star. In another poem from the same period, upon Appleton House, Marvell seems almost to be teasing Fairfax when he portrays him as governor of a garden in which flowers are ranked in regiments and bees perform as sentinels. Marvell's wit clearly runs towards irony and intentional ambiguity, but there is no direct evidence that this poem was intended as anything other than a celebration of the life of ease and leisure, the contemplative life in the face of distracting ambitions and romantic passions. How seriously, one might ask, is the reader to take the mystical and transcendental mode of the sixth and seventh stanzas? Is Marvell anti-woman in the eighth stanza? Perhaps what makes this 300-year-old poem still worth reading is that such questions remain worth discussing. The answers to these questions, and to many others that spring from the garden, are very likely follow from the reader's decision as to how seriously Marvell's speaker is committed to the theme of withdrawal. Perhaps it is significant that while the return of time in the closing stanza is witty and pastoral, it returns nonetheless. Theme of man and the natural world. Marvell and an oak tree sitting together is a strange image, except that in the garden it is pretty much exactly right. Our speaker is obsessed with the garden. He loves it. But is the speaker arguing that nature is a necessary escape from the real world, or that his life in the garden should become an everyday reality? And what do you make of the fact that this poem is a pastoral and the natural world described by the poet is too perfect to exist in real life? The superiority of nature championed by the speaker is true for the specific individual in question. But Marvell does not mean to say that it is true for everyone. Different strokes for different gardeners. The passages praising nature in the garden are ironic because everything the speaker is celebrating was put there by the society he condemns or rejects. The writer surely knows there is a difference between a cultivated, manicured garden, something that was clearly designed by humans, and a forest. The theme of isolation. If Marvell thought it was hard to get some time to yourself back in the 1650s, it's almost impossible to imagine what he would have to say if he were alive today. What with people busy 24 by 7 and eyes glued to their smartphones. Getting some time alone, though, is just as important now as it was then. Although we are not saying you need to go to the extremes recommended in the garden. Isolation is of supreme value and importance in the garden, and the speaker does not care who he has to throw under the bus in order to get it. It is associated with escapism, that is अपनी वर्तमान स्थिति से भाग जाना. The speaker is trying to blow off all of society, but also with futility. The speaker knows he can never truly have the solitude that he craves. The speaker in the garden is totally self absorbed. He is way more concerned with himself than he is with nature. The speaker's desire to be alone in the garden is not anti women. It is an expression of his desire to live in an environment where sexual temptation cannot lead him astray. The theme of ambition. Ambition is the first major theme to come up, but it is not exactly being portrayed in a positive light. Our speaker spends several lines criticizing ambition in the opening stanzas, but a little digging reveals that he isn't without ambitions of his own. The speaker's criticism of men's public ambitions in stanza 1 is unfair, as the speaker is an ambitious figure himself. The garden portrays ambition as a bad thing, a character flaw, and thinks the same thing of the people who strive for recognition. Philosophical viewpoints, metaphysics. Andrew Marvell deals with the big questions about tough topics, and the garden is no exception. The mind, soul, and human existence are at the heart of this poem. Marvell uses a natural setting, the garden, as a stage for his metaphysical thoughts to play up the contrast between the physical and the metaphysical. The natural world, as described in the garden, is an example of metaphysical thinking. Marvell is describing a garden not as it exists, but as one of the far other worlds the speaker's mind is capable of dreaming up. Forms and devices. Andrew Marvell employs iambic tetrameter in this poem, generally in the form of closed couplets. For a meditative poem, one might expect the lengthier and more formal pentameter, that is 10-syllable couplet, but Marvell insists on the lighter and more lyrical line. This is not to imply that the poem is superficial in any way, but it is a reminder that the tone of the poem remains witty and even somewhat playful throughout. Joseph Summers in Heirs of Dunn and Johnson argues that Marvell pushes the claims for the superiority of retirement to their ultimately absurd limits in this poem. The speaker teases the fond, means foolish lovers in the third stanza, and when he stumbles on melons, becomes ensnared in flowers, and falls on the grass in the fifth stanza, one is not reminded so much of the fall of Adam and Eve as of the antics of a man who has gorged himself, means he has eaten too much, and is left staggering drunkenly. This is not to undercut the striking imagery of that passage, with such rich assonance as luscious clusters of grapes which crush their wine on the speaker's mouth. The consonance that links the M and N sound of stumbling on melons assures him a soft fall. In the metaphors of the sixth stanza, the mind becomes an ocean, and the created world finds complete unity as a green thought in a green shade. The green thought is presumably life giving and innocent, as opposed to the destructive passions embodied in the colors red and white. Marvell's most elaborate metaphor occurs in the next stanza, where the body is regarded as clothing, meaning a vest, to be cast aside, and the soul becomes a bird with silver wings. Both metaphors are conventional enough. Their impact comes from the constant and from the language that Marvell uses to give them life. Consider, for example, the verbs associated with bird and soul: sits, sings, wets, combs, waves. The language of the garden is conceptually charged or loaded. The title itself suggests both a secular garden and the Garden of Eden, and Marvell fully exploits both significations. The skillful gardener of the last stanza may be an ordinary horticulturalist or God himself, and Marvell, like other people of his age, delights in the sort of wordplay that would allow the reader to think of the milder sun as something other than the star around which the earth rotates. Even time, by this stage of the poem, may refer as readily to the herb as to the hour. The title. One of the more popular interpretations of this poem is that the garden is about gardens in 17th century England, hence the title of the poem. Not surprisingly, there is a lot of support for this theory. The poem certainly talks a lot about flowers, trees, fruits, nature, and other gardenly things. Plus, European gardens from the 1600s were usually very carefully landscaped, so the idea that Marvell's uniform stands and meters mirror the uniform stanzas and meter mirror the formal symmetrical layout of the traditional 17th century gardens is understandable. But the poem is called The Garden, and when anyone from the 17th century is talking about the garden, it is usually the Garden of Eden they have in mind. This too makes a lot of sense because once upon a time, lots of British people thought of England as being a lot like the Garden of Eden. Marvell's use of the term garden state in line 57 is our first clue about the historical context that really brings this England as Eden concept home. Before Marvell was alive, England was ruled by Queen Elizabeth. One of the things she did was to make everyone in England believe that England was the best, something she accomplished in part by emphasizing the fact that God had a special destiny in store for the country, being unofficially considered the promised land, plus the fact that England was green and filled with lots of flowers, was enough for many people in the late 1500s. So the idea of England as Eden was born. By the time Marvell was writing, though England had been through civil wars, international conflicts, plague, economic failure, and had killed a king only to reinstate his morally questionable brother. Whatever Garden of Eden points Queen Elizabeth I had racked up during her reign were obliterated, means removed, and then some. So, why was Marvel talking about England as some idealized garden paradise when it so clearly was not? One thought is that Marvel is longing for a return to more peaceful times, both spiritually and politically. Another is that he is looking forward to England's bright future now that all the nastiness of the wars, sickness, death, starvation has been dealt with. Or perhaps the Garden of Eden references are meant to expose the decaying state of England, not its glorious past or future. A fourth theory is that the Bible has nothing to do with this poem at all, and the speaker is just trying to talk about plain old regular gardens. Analysis. The garden is divided into nine numbered stanzas, each of which contains four rhymed couplets of iambic pentameter. Its subject matter is the tranquility of retirement from public life. Most critics associate the poem's content with Marvell's own retirement from his position as tutor to Mary Fairfax, whose father, Thomas, was a general in Oliver Cromwell's army during the English Civil War. In the first stanza, the speaker mentions three forms of public virtue associated with the emblem of a particular plant's leaves: the palm for military virtue, the oak for civic virtue, and the bay or laurel for poetic virtue. However, these symbols also suggest the limitations of the pursuits they signify, since the wreaths are only made of trimmings from the actual plants. Public life and devotion to virtue must come to an end one day. The speaker suggests that just as flowers and trees do close to weave the garlands of repose, so must individuals retreat from social obligation into retired contemplation. The speaker goes on to praise the solitude and quiet of his retreat into the garden, believing that he was mistaken to have once sought fair quiet and innocence among the busy companies of men. He also associates his private retreat with a holy experience, stating that the sacred plants of quiet and innocence can only grow amongst the organic plants in the garden. In other words, the material surrounding of the garden makes room in the speaker's heart and mind for the cultivation of spiritual values, which life and society has forced him to disregard. The speaker continues to develop his extended conceit of the garden's super virtues, finding its lovely green more favorable than red and white, which are the colors poets most often used in erotic poetry to describe the lips, teeth, face, and body of a beloved. Poets may carve the name of their beloved into trees, but the speaker finds such actions to be fruitless because each tree already contains a more beautiful imprint, a proper name. By using this image, Marvel refers to the Renaissance doctrine of a signatura rerum, or a signature of all things, which held that God imprinted each entity he created with the sign of its proper name and gave Adam the power to recognize these signs. The speaker thus imagines his experience in the garden as a paradisal return to Adam's perfect knowledge of creation. The speaker continues to praise the abundant fruits, vines, flowers, and grass in the garden. But at the end of stanza 5, the speaker's image of this natural cornucopia abruptly shifts when he finds himself stumbling on melons and ensnared with flowers. He falls into the grass, which suggests that the garden's private efflorescence has become too much for him to manage, as if it has overwhelmed his bodily senses. Hence, he retreats into his mind, where the powers of contemplation become a source of superior activity. His mind is capable of making other worlds and other seas that transcend the limitations of physical embodiment, thereby annihilating all that is made to a green thought in a green shade. Since this new shade of green denotes the creative power of the intellect, it appears to surpass the lovely green plants and trees that the speaker mentioned earlier. The speaker then presents an image of his soul detaching from his body but remaining in the garden. It simply glides into the tree limbs like a bird, waving its wings to reflect the light of the sun until it is ready for its longer flight. The image suggests that during the soul's time on earth, it is possible for it to transcend some of the physical body's limitations, as we see in the speaker's previous contemplation of a green thought in a green shade. Yet the soul cannot entirely detach itself from the physical world until the moment of bodily death. So, for the time being, it must remain perched upon the highest reaches that the garden allows. Thus, the poem's final stanza contains an extended metaphor comparing the garden to a private universe, containing its own fragrant zodiac of flowers and a cosmic timekeeper in the form of the bee, whose industrious labors mark the passage of time. With this, we end this session. We will continue in the next session. Thank you.